Thank you, Shauna. Wow, what a hard act to follow. But Lisa, it's so great to see you. And frankly, you are always music to our ears. So welcome back to Verge.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Shanna. And welcome to Apple Park, virtually this time.
Yeah, great view of Apple Park, the spaceship, if you will. Um, so it's always great to open this event with somebody that is so respect. It was also fitting in a number of ways as our focus this year extends beyond the traditional look at technology and the clean economy to include social justice and equity issues. And Lisa, I know you've got a long history with this in your role as the EPA administrator during the first term of President Obama. You prioritized protecting people of color and low income communities from pollution and waste. And in your role at Apple, you've been leading into social justice issues in a number of ways. And that's kind of what I want to talk with you about today. So, to begin, there's something I heard you say pretty recently, which I think kind of sets the stage. You said, maybe we shouldn't take on climate change, we should take on justice. And by doing so, we can solve the climate crisis. Talk a little bit, what did you mean by that?
Thanks, Joel. And also thanks for including social justice right at the top of Verge. It's emblematic of the kind of leadership you've always shown and how you point business in the direction of the next big thing. So for me, I think a lot lately about, Shauna mentioned intersections. Verge has always talked about intersections. I think in my case, it's almost personal intersections. I grew up in New Orleans. I know what it means to be at the receiving end of our industrial society, whether it's the air quality coming from petrochemical facilities upwind, or the water quality coming down the Mississippi River, or the Gulf of Mexico's health and that ecosystem and diversity. All those issues conflate to me around a place I call home, right? And so as I've thought during this time, especially with COVID-19, we all saw the study that said that part of what's contributing to the impacts of COVID-19 is air quality. So I started to think if we had focused on those environmental justice issues, those fence line communities that for years and years have been telling us, look, it is not healthy to be here. They are, unfortunately, the same communities who were sort of the first wave of the health impacts of pollution on our society. And I guess to me it all comes together because we know that the co-pollutants of CO2 from fossil fuel and from the fossil fuel burning power sector and transportation sectors are all part of that justice equation. If you add on that the fact that, again, I'm from New Orleans, I know firsthand that low-lying areas that during times of racial segregation and larger issues of racism around the world, oftentimes when land use decisions are made in rooms, the land that's most susceptible to flooding or most susceptible to wildfire, the exurbs, the cheaper land is given to communities that are less well off. And so then they're on the front line again of dealing with the flooding, the droughts, now the climate fires. I heard someone say call them climate fires, but the wildfires that we see proliferating in our time. So again, it's a justice issue. How do the resources of our world, which flow up to the people who make these land use decisions and profit from them, but they're not flowing to the people who are now victims? And I think those are the questions we have to solve if we're really going to solve the climate crisis.
So let's talk a little bit about what you're doing at Apple, because it's one thing to say let's stop the bad stuff, but there's also this: how can we begin to, you know, flip the conversation, flip our way of thinking, and start to be proactively engaged with some of these frontline communities. And you've been doing that in part by prioritizing Black and Brown communities in procurement and supply chain and some other issues. Tell us a little bit about what you're specifically you're doing and how it's going.
Yeah, thanks. We have a pretty new racial equity and justice initiative at Apple. We've always had, of course, inclusion and diversity underlying our work inside the company. And like many Silicon Valley companies, we've made progress, but we are committed to doing much more. But in June, our CEO, Tim Cook, asked me to lead a new initiative called REGGIE, the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative. Some people laugh because it's Reggie and Jackson, if you're a Reggie Jackson fan. But that's an easy way to
As
remember it.
Reggie Jackson, for the uninitiated, was a great baseball player for these Oakland A's and then later on for the Yankees.
And we're Mets fans, but we're okay. Reggie Jackson, see, but so Reggie is we're investing in three different areas. The idea was how can a consumer products company like Apple, with the reach we have and also the contact with customers that we have, use our platform to advance the fight against systemic racism. So a hugely new initiative in a way. How can we look at education, a field that Apple has always had, has a long history in and had a leadership role in? The first Macs were in the classroom. How can we say, now what if our products and our services and the work we do were geared towards, erasing the systemic barriers to equal education and opportunity that we see in our country? How can we use our voice in economic empowerment? You mentioned raising our spend with Black and Brown-owned businesses. Apple spends billions of dollars a year in this country alone, and then billions more around the world procuring services and supplies. How can that dollar, how can that euro, how can that yen, how can that RMB, how can it also include building wealth in communities so that we're talking about systemic economic disempowerment changing into a system of empowerment? So we're also looking at our supply chain and our services spend. And then the last is how can we support those groups? We certainly don't have expertise in criminal justice reform, but we are mindful that some of the technologies from our iPhones, from smartphones more generally, are what's illuminated the murder of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor and so many more, that brought so many people, so many allies to this moment of saying we have to make a change. So I think, again, this idea of intersections, I also think that those two intersect with climate. One of the things we did in the economic empowerment space is come up with this idea of an impact accelerator. How can we grow some Black and Brown-owned businesses that are working on the issue of climate change? Because we've always said that climate change is an economic opportunity. How can we make sure that opportunity is spread equally?
So how does this connect to the environmental initiatives that you're engaged in? So for example, the closed materials loop, no more mining, no more extracting is one of the goals you set some time ago for, again, off in the future. And obviously renewable energy and a whole range of other things that you've been doing. Are you able to connect those opportunities that you're sending to Black and Brown communities, to prioritizing frontline communities with those initiatives?
Yeah, I hope that's what you see in those initiatives. So for instance, you mentioned our commitment to the circular economy. 2 years ago, Tim Cook, our CEO, said that we wanted to one day make our products from either renewable or recycled materials. So really moving away from that linear supply chain where you take it, you use it, and eventually it ends up, not used again, maybe thrown away. We already ran a world-class recycling program, but what wasn't happening was getting those raw materials back into our products. So you really had the full circle supply chain. When we started to look at the circular supply chain and prioritize where to go first, we prioritized things like conflict minerals. We prioritized rare earth elements for two reasons. One, because of the labor and supply chain difficulties around conflict minerals, as much as we want to continue to engage in communities to try to lift up the standards and use our purchasing power to lift up, we also had to be honest with ourselves and say there's also a need for us to show an alternative path so that if these mining operations, however they're organized, just cannot come into a better situation with respect to supply chain, environment, and labor issues, we need an alternative. And that alternative is already out in the world in our products, in the incredibly, high quality materials that go into our products. So it was at both an effort to prioritize the places where the most potential for harm could be, but also to give us an alternative because that gives us bargaining power. If we can come up with a cleaner alternative, then our belief is that these other places will have no alternative but to clean up as well so that they can be competitive, not just on an economic level, but on a social and environmental level as well.
And I imagine that there's some resilience impacts as well in terms of diversifying your supply chain. What do you see there?
Joel, such a good point. Absolutely. We have thought a lot about, and I think a lot of companies in this COVID moment think a lot about their supply chains, what can and will happen. We also have a lot of geopolitical tension in the world where we see various trade and the ability to trade being impacted. All of those are part of the decision making around our look at how we maintain resilience in our supply chain. And I can tell you, I have never said this before, but a peek behind the curtain, it's part of our planning for resilience in our supply chain as well. So it's actually really great, Joel, because it gives me and my team a seat at the table, and it's being offered willingly inside the company on very strategic decisions around supply chain and the future, looking out, decades, that I think means to me that this work is lasting and will always be a part of how we do business, which of course I know for everyone on the call, that's kind of the holy grail of the work that we do, right?
Indeed. I think a lot of our audience, Lisa, is say this is great, but I don't know that I could do that in my company. Or they're concerned about reliability issues, price issues, just new vendors who may not have had worked with in the past, which is can be a challenge. What have you learned? What's easier? What's harder? What surprised you in terms of how you work with sort of new and let's say non-traditional suppliers and business partners?
Really good question. I think a couple of things that there is incredible intentionality among small and medium-sized enterprises, all the way up to the big partners that we're used to working with, to do better and do more. It's being driven by the advocacy community and NGOs. It's being driven by the finance community, where investors and shareholders are starting to prioritize their investments because they've seen what COVID can do or a crisis can do to a business that hasn't thought about resilience and sustainability. So there's a lot of this moment, there are a lot of eyes turning towards doing something different. Apple can help, I think, by modeling and also taking a risk on technologies and ways of doing business and quickly scaling them. So for example, the iPhone 12 series that was just released, all of the rare earth elements in the magnets in all of those products are 100% recycled. So we went from an idea just a year ago in one product to across the whole, new product line. We were able to scale that quickly. So we're not, we're able to take some chances, to have a little bit of patience around the very first application. But what we really love is, I think what Apple brings to the table is once we find something that we believe works and doesn't, we have no quality problems, no reliability problems, we test it, the material is essentially the same, performs the same, then we're ready to go at scale. And that's going to be the exciting work for Apple, I think, is in the next years, is to not only do it first, but to do it bigger. And to hopefully leave behind a supply chain that's now economical and accessible for other people, because those industries, those enterprises will say, okay, there's probably more people who want to buy recycled material as well, and that's the circular economy.
Well, we've got to go in a sec, but before we hand it back to Shauna, really quickly, how are you keeping hopeful?
You know, I I actually find hope in the challenges. I think we, as environmental advocates, we're taught that it's always a fight. So we're used to looking at the mountain and knowing there's always more work to do. But when a company like Apple issues a goal and says by 2030, we're going to be carbon neutral, when the CEO and the board of this company embrace that, and a goal like that, they have to. When we as a company say it out loud, those are moments that for me let me know that things will change.
Yeah.
You know, when I came to Apple, it was to to help the private sector, to help this wonderful company be all it could be in in a fight that we know we have no choice but to win.
Yeah.
And so that keeps me hopeful because we have real progress.
And you keep me hopeful, Lisa Jackson. Uh, Hand it back to you, Shauna, but please join me in thanking Apple Vice President for Environment Policy and Social Initiatives, Lisa Jackson. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you. Bye, everybody.